In distinguishing between sex and gender, we learned how, while both are social constructions, the way we think about gender focuses on the normative expectations that go with our sex. And this is something that is socialized. We are expected to internalize and then express these normative expectations. And because gender is socialized, it's important to recognize that it has both personal and societal dimensions and implications. In other words, we need to examine gender in two different ways. We need to examine it as both an individual experience and as a social institution. Gender means different things for individuals than it does for society. To give you an idea of how they are different, I recommend checking out the Components of Gender handout, which is available to you on Moodle. It identifies contrasting sets of concepts regarding gender, one set focusing on gender as an individual experience, and the other for gender as a societal phenomenon or institution. You might find some of those concepts very helpful to you for your paper. But let's get an overview of this distinction. As individuals who are expected to internalize our dominant culture, gender is all about sameness. It's all about learning to conform to the normative expectations we have for our respective gender boxes. So, girls are taught to grow up just like all the other girls and to become women just like all the other women in our society. They're given dolls to play with and dresses to wear. And of course, boys are taught to grow up just like all the other boys and to become men just like all the other men in our society. They're given trucks and baseballs to play with. When girls in our society enter adolescence, something fascinating happens. They are introduced to the feminine hygiene aisle at the drugstore. Drugstores are amazing places. Have you ever stopped to think about it? Next time you go into a drugstore, I want you to notice the proportion of the store that is devoted entirely to being a woman. Not only is there an entire aisle for feminine hygiene, but there's another entire aisle for cosmetics, and yet another aisle for women's hair. Men get half an aisle, and it's basically limited to shaving and condoms. What's that all about? If being a woman was simply a matter of biology, of chromosomes and genitalia, there'd be no need for any of that crap. And it doesn't have to be that way. But our society says that it does. That's our objective reality, and it demands a certain amount of conformity. When women and men buy their respective gender products, they also buy into the normative expectations for their assigned gender. They buy into their respective gender jail cells. And if you don't internalize and then externalize that correctly, you're defined as sick, as if you were cold in a room everyone else thought was hot. Here's an example of that sameness and conformity that I'm talking about, but from a culture that's very different from our own. These are the Wodabe people in Niger, West Africa. Notice how similarly dressed everyone is to one another. Again, gender is all about learning to be the same as everyone else in your category. So, just like us, the Wodabe have an elaborate way of signifying gender by making all the women alike and all the men virtually alike. The primary difference here is that these pictures are of men. Clearly, the gender rules are different from our own. Among the Wodabe, it's the men who have to worry about their appearance and work hard to be attractive in the eyes of women. The more they show their teeth and the whites of their eyes, the more attractive they're considered to be. Women take this into account when choosing a husband. In fact, they'll walk down a line of men like this in order to look them over. And so the men are basically competing with one another here. So it's the men who have to make an effort to be pretty and charming with colorful attire and makeup in order to attract a mate. Just imagine what their drugstores are like compared to ours. Could you imagine a masculine hygiene aisle in our own drugstores? And if you think about it, the aisle space for men's grooming products has been slowly growing over the past couple of decades. Just so you can see the difference, here's the photo of a Wadave woman in traditional attire. There's still makeup and jewelry, but it's far more subdued looking overall, and you'd never confuse one gender with the other. Again, the underlying point here is that at the individual level, gender means being socialized to be the same as all of those who share your gender. It's all about conforming to a rather narrow set of normative expectations for one's assigned gender. As we interact as gendered people, we bring into play the way we were socialized into dressing and behaving, so our daily interactions allow for two things. They allow for expressing our gender differences, and as we do so, we end up producing those same gender differences. Sociologist Irving Goffin talks about this relationship using the concept of gender displays. Gender displays provide evidence for what gender a person is through the cues they generate in their behavior and appearance. These gender displays allow us to express and enact our gender, but in following these gender display rules, we also end up producing gender differences. And that leads us to take a step back and look at gender as a social system or an institution. So, while as an individual experience, gender is all about learning to be the same as those who share your gender, at the societal level, gender is all about distinguishing the differences between the gender categories. In other words, as a social institution, the emphasis is placed on separating male from female by highlighting the differences between them. Goffin points out that a key way in which gender is given significance in society is through the process of institutional reflexivity. This is basically the process where we make biological sex differences socially significant. So the biology of sex and our institutional arrangement of gender reflect each other. When we look at society, men and women are seen as fundamentally different and are divided up, separated as a result. And this is true even if they are doing the same thing. For example, we all go to the bathroom, but we have separate bathrooms, one for men, another for women. Augsburg has been working to remove gender distinctions in this regard and creating what have been termed gender-neutral bathrooms. This sign appears on the door of a bathroom on the ground level of Memorial Hall. But I ask you, is this truly gender neutral? This hardly seems neutral since it presents us with the same exact gender binary. There's even a line between them, giving us a sense of each gender being restricted to their respective boxes. Perhaps this would be a better way to do it. And if you think these issues are trivial, think about the fierce political battles that have been waged in different states around the country, trying to restrict where trans-identified people will be allowed to use the restroom. Clearly, the structure of gender and the gender binary is deeply embedded throughout our society and in our minds. This example focused on physical spaces, and by extension, social spaces as well. Segregating the gender in this way lends legitimacy to our societal belief that gender differences are actually significant, when in fact they oftentimes aren't. Our physical and social spaces have been divided up between the genders so that it is clear to everyone that the differences between them are fundamentally important. Gender is also built right into our language in order to divide the world between the sexes. The obvious example would be the pronouns traditionally available in English, but it goes much further than that. For example, in the past, some people were called, quote, confirmed bachelors, while others were known as, quote, old maids. We use different words, like player and slut, to describe people of different genders engaging in basically the same behavior, and notice the judgment carried by one term and not the other. People of all genders spray stuff on their bodies that make them smell nice, but when these products are packaged for women, we call it perfume, and when it's packaged for men, we call it cologne. The kind of scent also differs between the two, but it's essentially the same stuff. And heaven help the person who uses the wrong product. Men and women are supposed to have different kinds of jobs, but if they do the same thing, these jobs often have different titles. For example, one is likely to be known as an administrative assistant, and the other an executive secretary, not to mention that one is more likely to make more money. This cultural separation of the sexes is so important to us that crossing over the boundary is often considered taboo. So if men and women are too much alike, we are breaking what's called the sameness taboo. For example, women were first allowed into West Point, the Army's military academy, in 1976. At a dance that year, administrators were disturbed by the sight of couples who looked virtually the same dancing together. Both parties were wearing pants and had short hair, and this upset their sensibilities regarding gender. From that point on, women weren't allowed to dance at the party unless they wore a skirt, because otherwise it upset the idea that our genders should be different. So they actually changed the uniform so that female soldiers and cadets had to wear skirts. Those in the Marines often serve in ceremonial roles for affairs of state. As a result, female soldiers have to wear makeup, lipstick and eyeshadow at least, and they have to take classes in makeup, hair care, poise, and etiquette. Men also go through training, but it's in things like how to escort a woman into a social gathering, how to hold doors, and so on. All of this is meant to keep men and women visibly different from one another. These are two rather light examples, but the policy of keeping the genders separate and distinct, combined with the idea that men are the ideal and the standard, which we'll talk more about later, was responsible for keeping women at home as the primary caregivers for children, not allowing women to vote, and paying women less for the same amount of work. Women still earn only 77 cents to a dollar earned by a man doing the same thing. And the Equal Rights Amendment has yet to become law. And not to mention the complete erasure of additional gender identities. To wrap this all up, gender is much more than biology, even if biology wasn't as shady as it is. And gender is very different when you look at it as a social institution compared to our individual experience of it. Again, if gender were simply a matter of biology, there would be no variations from one culture to another. But there are variations between cultures, and there are even variations within the same culture when you compare different time periods in that culture's history. In the US, for example, it's customary today for boys to wear blue and girls to wear pink. But that wasn't always true. Until World War I, boys were dressed in pink and girls in blue because pink was seen as a stronger color. It's brighter and more vibrant, what we've culturally defined as masculine qualities, whereas blue recedes and is much more subdued, what we've culturally defined as feminine qualities. Variations like these tell us, and this is the central point of this entire topic, both sex and gender are a cultural phenomenon, not simply a biological one.